What if hell wasn't beneath the earth, but rising in steam from sugar fields under a tropical sun? What if the wealth that sweetened Europe's tables was forged not just in chains, but in boiling flesh? Tonight's story drags you into a place where screams vanished into cane smoke and cruelty wore silk and lace. The sugar plantation was never simply a place of work. It was a carefully engineered world where suffering was built into every routine, every sound, every smell. From dawn to nightfall, the enslaved lived inside a system designed to exhaust the body and fracture the mind. And nowhere was this more evident than in the spaces where sugar was processed. The mill was not just an industrial center, but a stage where power announced itself through heat, noise, and danger. Enormous rollers crushed cane without mercy, while furnaces burned day and night, demanding constant feeding. Accidents were common, but punishment was intentional, and pain became inseparable from labor itself. The boiling house was the most feared place on the plantation, not because it was secret, but because it was always visible. Cauldrons of thick syrup simmered endlessly, filling the air with a sweetness that clung to the lungs. For those forced to work there, the heat was unbearable, the hours relentless, and the threat constant. A slip, a moment of weakness, or a perceived act of disobedience could turn routine labor into ritualized suffering. The plantation owner and overseers understood that fear worked best when it was public, when others could see what happened to those who crossed invisible lines. Punishment on sugar estates was rarely impulsive. It followed patterns meant to humiliate, isolate, and terrify. Whippings were staged, chains were displayed, and iron collars were fitted not just to restrain, but to mark. These acts communicated a clear message that the plantation was a closed universe where resistance led only to escalating cruelty. Over time, labor itself became a form of slow violence. Long shifts under the sun, inadequate food, and untreated injuries ensured that bodies broke down quickly, making workers disposable and replaceable. In Pernambuco, where sugar wealth concentrated enormous power in the hands of a few families, the plantation operated almost like a private kingdom. Laws existed on paper, but distance and corruption meant enforcement was rare. What happened within the estate gates was considered the owner's affair. This autonomy allowed punishments to grow more extreme, shaped by the belief that terror was necessary to maintain order among hundreds of enslaved people. Fear was not a side effect of the system, it was the system. The boiling cauldrons symbolized this reality more than any other object. They represented profit, discipline, and domination all at once. Sugar had to be boiled at precise temperatures, constantly watched, constantly stirred. The enslaved were expected to perform this dangerous task flawlessly, even as exhaustion blurred their vision and sweat burned their eyes. Failure meant punishment, and punishment often took place in the very space where labor occurred, collapsing the boundary between work and torture. Stories circulated among the enslaved about punishments that went beyond the known limits. Stories whispered at night and carried from plantation to plantation. Whether every account was true mattered less than the fear they produced. The idea that the tools of production could become tools of death reinforced the belief that there was no safe place on the estate. Even the processes that generated wealth were weapons, capable of destroying those who served them. This environment reshaped human behavior. Some learned to disappear into obedience, making themselves invisible to survive. Others broke under the pressure, their resistance punished so severely that it served as a warning to all who watched. The plantation thrived on this cycle, extracting labor while erasing individuality. Names were replaced with numbers or nicknames, histories reduced to physical output, and suffering normalized through repetition. What made this system especially horrifying was its ordinariness. The boiling house operated every day. The cauldrons were always hot. Overseers carried out their duties as part of a routine, not a crisis. Violence was scheduled, expected, and woven into daily life. It was not chaos, but order, a disciplined cruelty that allowed vast fortunes to grow while countless lives were consumed. The sugar that left Pernambuco carried none of this visible suffering. Once refined and shipped, it became a symbol of comfort and luxury in distant markets. The people who enjoyed it never saw the heat, the scars, or the fear that made it possible. On the plantation, however, every grain represented hours of pain, and every boiling cauldron stood as a reminder that wealth here was measured not just in profit, but in how much terror could be enforced before the human spirit finally collapsed under the weight of endless labor and watched brutality where survival depended on silence and the constant awareness that the machinery of sugar was also the machinery of domination and control, designed to crush resistance before it could even form. On the plantation, power was not abstract or distant. It was embodied in a single figure whose will shaped every breath taken by those enslaved beneath them. The owner was judge, jury, and executioner, operating in a world where wealth translated directly into authority and where the humanity of others was legally erased. Enslaved people were classified as property, but on estates like those in Pernambuco, they were treated as something even less stable than objects, valued only when productive and punished when perceived as inconvenient. This absolute control created an atmosphere where fear was constant, because life itself depended on the moods, impulses, and beliefs of one individual. The owner's authority extended far beyond labor assignments. It governed marriage, family, movement, punishment, and survival. Enslaved parents could not protect their children, partners could not protect each other, and no promise carried weight unless it aligned with the owner's interests. A family could be separated without explanation, sold, or relocated as casually as livestock. This uncertainty was deliberate, because instability weakened resistance and ensured obedience. When people never knew what tomorrow might bring, compliance became a survival instinct. In Pernambuco, distance from urban centers amplified this unchecked power. Plantations functioned as isolated worlds, surrounded by fields that acted as natural barriers. Visitors were rare, inspections were superficial, and complaints from enslaved people were almost impossible to deliver, let alone have taken seriously. Even when rumors of extreme cruelty circulated, authorities often dismissed them as exaggerations or accepted bribes to look away. The owner's word outweighed any accusation, especially when the economy depended on uninterrupted sugar production. Punishment was one of the most visible expressions of this dominance. It was not merely corrective but symbolic, meant to remind everyone who ruled. Whippings were public, chains were displayed, and confinement was prolonged to break both body and will. The severity of these punishments often had little connection to the alleged offense. A broken tool, a slowed pace, or a misunderstood glance could trigger extreme consequences. What mattered was not justice, but control and unpredictability made that control more effective. Women on plantations were particularly vulnerable under this system of absolute power. They faced not only physical punishment but sexual exploitation that carried no legal consequences for the perpetrator. Refusal was considered defiance, and defiance invited retaliation. Children born from these abuses belonged not to their mothers but to the owner, increasing his wealth while deepening the trauma of those forced to endure it. This dynamic reinforced the idea that even the most intimate aspects of life were subject to ownership. Overseers acted as extensions of the owner's authority, enforcing discipline with enthusiasm to prove loyalty and secure their positions. Some were brutal by nature, others by necessity, but all operated within a structure that rewarded cruelty. Mercy was seen as weakness, and leniency as a threat to order. By delegating violence, owners created layers of fear that permeated every interaction, ensuring that control was maintained even in their absence. The legal system supported this hierarchy. Enslaved people could not testify against their owners, and injuries were often attributed to accidents or illness. Deaths were recorded without investigation, listed as losses rather than crimes. This legal invisibility allowed abuse to escalate unchecked. Knowing they would not be held accountable, some owners pushed boundaries further, experimenting with punishment to instill deeper terror and reinforce their dominance. What made this power especially destructive was its normalization. Children born into slavery grew up watching violence as a routine part of life, learning early that authority was absolute and resistance was fatal. Over time, fear became internalized, shaping behavior even when no overseer was present. The plantation did not need constant surveillance because the threat of punishment lived in the minds of the enslaved, guiding their actions through anticipation alone. This absolute power also isolated the owner psychologically. Surrounded by wealth and obedience, they existed in an echo chamber where empathy eroded and cruelty went unchallenged. Acts that would have been unthinkable in another context became ordinary. justified as necessary discipline or economic efficiency. The absence of consequences allowed personal impulses to masquerade as authority, blurring the line between governance and sadism. The plantation thrived on this imbalance, extracting maximum labor while suppressing rebellion through terror rather than trust. Every command carried the weight of life or death, and every day unfolded under the knowledge that survival depended entirely on submission to a power that was unrestrained, unobserved, and unchallenged, a power that could decide in an instant who would live, who would suffer, and who would vanish into the machinery of the estate without record or remembrance beyond the fields where their blood and sweat had already been absorbed into the soil, and the routines continued as if nothing had ever been taken from them. Punishment on the plantation was never meant to correct behavior alone. It was designed to be seen, remembered, and feared. Every act of violence carried a message far larger than its immediate victim. When an enslaved person was dragged into the yard, tied to a post, or forced to kneel before an overseer, the audience mattered as much as the act itself. Terror worked best when it spread, when dozens of eyes were forced to witness what disobedience looked like in its most extreme form, and when the sound of pain lingered long after the body was carried away. The rituals of punishment followed a deliberate choreography. Whippings were timed, measured, and often announced in advance so that labor could pause and attention could be redirected. Chains clanked loudly, iron collars reflected the sun, and instruments of restraint were displayed like warnings. These were not private corrections carried out in shame. They were performances of dominance. The plantation relied on memory, ensuring that even those who were not punished personally would carry the fear forward in their minds. Over time, punishments escalated because familiarity weakened their impact. What once terrified eventually became expected, so new extremes were introduced to maintain control. Solitary confinement in dark sheds, prolonged exposure to heat or rain, starvation, and forced labor while injured were methods meant to break endurance rather than kill outright. Survival itself became part of the punishment, a slow erosion of strength that reminded the enslaved that mercy was not a right but a temporary condition granted at the whim of power. The most effective punishments blurred the line between labor and violence, forcing someone to work longer hours in the boiling house, assigning them to the most dangerous tasks, or denying rest during harvest season transformed productivity into torture. Mistakes made under exhaustion were then punished further, creating a cycle that trapped the victim in perpetual suffering. This system ensured that fear was constant because punishment was no longer a separate event but something embedded in daily work. Public humiliation was another powerful weapon. Stripping individuals of dignity through exposure, mockery, or forced submission attacked identity as much as the body. Being made to kneel, crawl, or beg in front of others shattered any remaining sense of self. These acts communicated that resistance was not just painful but degrading, and that the plantation had the power to erase a person's humanity entirely. Children were often forced to witness punishments, ensuring that fear took root early. Seeing parents or elders beaten taught obedience before language could. Trauma became an inheritance, passed down through observation rather than words. The plantation did not need to explain its rules. The consequences explained themselves. Even games, songs, and whispered stories among the enslaved carried the shadow of punishment, shaping behavior through caution and silence. What made this terror especially effective was its unpredictability. Rules were vague, enforcement arbitrary, and punishment disproportionate. A glance interpreted as defiance, a pause mistaken for laziness, or a rumor of resistance could trigger extreme consequences. This uncertainty kept everyone off balance. When people could not anticipate what would anger those in power, the safest response was total submission. Fear thrived in this ambiguity, turning every moment into a test of survival. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Many enslaved people began to police themselves and each other, discouraging risk and suppressing anger to avoid collective punishment. This internalization of fear reduced the need for constant oversight. The plantation became self-regulating, not through loyalty, but through terror embedded so deeply that it shaped thought itself. Resistance still existed, but it was cautious, fragmented, and often hidden behind masks of compliance. Punishment also served to isolate individuals. Those targeted were marked as examples, separated from the group through confinement or stigmatization. Afterward, others often avoided them, not out of cruelty, but fear of association. This isolation weakened solidarity and made collective resistance more difficult. The system thrived on division, ensuring that pain did not unite the enslaved, but instead drove them inward, each person focused on personal survival. In extreme cases, punishment crossed into spectacle so horrifying that it became legend. Stories of unbearable cruelty spread beyond individual plantations, carried by new arrivals, runaways, and whispered conversations at night. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories amplified fear far beyond the original act. Terror did not need to be repeated everywhere if its reputation traveled ahead of it, shaping behavior before violence even occurred. This transformation of punishment into terror allowed plantation owners to rule with fewer resources and less resistance. Violence became efficient, fear economical. The body was disciplined through pain, the mind through anticipation, and the spirit through hopelessness. Every scream served a purpose, every scar a reminder, every memory a tool of control that lingered long after wounds closed, embedding obedience into the fabric of daily life, where even silence felt safer than speech and compliance became the only visible path through a world where terror was not an exception, but the foundation upon which order was built and maintained through relentless repetition, and the understanding that any challenge, no matter how small, could be met with a response so overwhelming that it erased not just the act of defiance, but the individual who dared to imagine something beyond submission. Silence on the plantation was not accidental. It was cultivated, enforced, and rewarded. Everyone knew what happened within the boundaries of the estate, yet almost no one spoke of it openly. Enslaved people learned early that words could be as dangerous as actions. Speaking about cruelty, questioning authority, or even sharing grief risked punishment. Silence became a shield, a fragile form of protection in a world where attention could be fatal. This quiet was not peace, but tension held in the chest, a constant restraint that shaped every interaction. Among the enslaved, silence functioned as survival. Stories of violence were whispered only at night, when darkness offered a thin illusion of safety. Even then, voices were low, sentences unfinished, names omitted. Memory was shared carefully, because knowledge itself could be dangerous. To know too much was to carry fear constantly, but to forget entirely was impossible. The result was a haunted quiet, where everyone understood the rules without needing them spoken aloud. Overseers and plantation staff also participated in this silence, though for different reasons. Many witnessed acts of extreme brutality but treated them as routine. Some justified their inaction as obedience to orders, others as necessity for discipline, and some as indifference shaped by repetition. Speaking out threatened livelihoods and safety. In isolated plantations like those in Pernambuco, loyalty to the owner meant protection, while dissent meant dismissal, punishment, or worse. Silence became a currency exchanged for security. Beyond the plantation, society played its role. Local communities depended on sugar wealth, and questioning its source threatened the economic foundation of the region. Merchants, officials, and clergy often knew of abuses but chose not to investigate deeply. Rumors circulated, but they remained rumors, softened by distance and disbelief. The enslaved were rarely considered reliable witnesses, and their suffering was dismissed as exaggeration or necessity. This collective denial allowed cruelty to continue without interruption. Religious institutions sometimes reinforced this quiet. Sermons emphasized obedience, patience, and suffering as virtues, reframing brutality as part of a divine order rather than human choice. Confession offered spiritual relief without demanding structural change. By focusing on individual morality rather than systemic violence, religion often provided comfort to perpetrators and bystanders while offering little protection to victims. This moral framework helped transform silence into righteousness. Records from the period reflect this absence of voices. Plantation logs documented productivity, losses, and expenses, but rarely mentioned punishment beyond vague references. Deaths were noted without context, injuries attributed to accidents. Legal documents favored property rights over human testimony. The lack of written evidence was not proof of absence, but evidence of suppression. What was not recorded could not be challenged, and what could not be challenged could continue indefinitely. This silence shaped memory long after the events themselves. Generations later, stories survived, fragmented, distorted, or erased entirely. Descendants inherited gaps where history should have been. The violence that built fortunes was often omitted from family narratives, replaced with tales of hard work and tradition. Silence protected reputations while burying truth. The past became selective, remembering success while forgetting the cost. For the enslaved, silence also carried emotional weight. Grief had no public space. Mourning was rushed, hidden, or forbidden. Tears were shed in private, and anger was swallowed to avoid attention. This emotional suppression left scars as deep as physical wounds. Pain without expression does not disappear. It settles, shaping behavior and identity. The plantation was filled with unspoken loss, a collective trauma that had no language permitted to describe it. Even acts of resistance were often silent. Sabotage, slow work, and feigned illness allowed defiance without words. Communication happened through glances, pauses, and shared understanding. Silence became a tool as well as a prison. It allowed resistance to exist beneath the surface, invisible to those in power. Yet this same silence limited coordination and made large-scale rebellion difficult, keeping defiance fragmented and fragile. The complicity of silence extended across oceans. Consumers who enjoyed sugar rarely questioned its origin. The product arrived refined, detached from its violent beginnings. Distance made silence easier. Without images, testimonies, or voices, suffering remained abstract. This global quiet allowed the system to expand, feeding on ignorance as much as fear. Every spoonful consumed without question reinforced the silence that protected brutality at its source. What makes this silence especially disturbing is how ordinary it became. It did not require constant enforcement. It sustained itself through habit, fear, and convenience. Everyone involved learned what not to say, what not to ask, and what not to remember. The plantation did not need walls to contain its secrets, because silence served as its strongest barrier, absorbing screams, burying evidence, and allowing violence to exist in plain sight without ever fully entering the record, leaving behind only fragments, whispers, and the heavy understanding that what was never spoken was still known by all who lived within its reach. Prosperity on the plantation was measured in output, acreage, and profit. But beneath these numbers lay a calculus of suffering that was rarely acknowledged. Sugar transformed Pernambuco into a region of immense wealth, drawing investment, prestige, and political influence. The big house stood as a monument to success, its architecture and furnishings displaying refinement and power. Yet, every polished surface reflected labor extracted through violence, and every expansion of wealth depended on the ability to normalize brutality as a necessary cost of production. The plantation economy rewarded efficiency above all else. Enslaved bodies were pushed to their limits because replacement was cheaper than preservation. Mortality was accepted as an operating expense calculated into profits. When people died from exhaustion, injury, or punishment, the loss was recorded financially, not morally. This logic allowed owners to justify extreme conditions as rational management rather than cruelty. In this system, compassion was inefficient and restraint was a liability. The wealth generated by sugar insulated its creators from scrutiny. Economic importance translated into political protection. Plantation owners influenced local authorities, shaped laws, and controlled narratives. Their success was celebrated as evidence of progress and civilization, masking the violence that sustained it. Critics, when they existed, were marginalized or silenced, accused of threatening stability or prosperity. The more profitable the system became, the harder it was to challenge because too many interests depended on its continuation. This normalization extended into daily routines. Violence did not disrupt production, it facilitated it. Punishments were scheduled around labor demands, and fear increased output by discouraging resistance. Over time, cruelty lost its shock value and became part of the rhythm of work. The extraordinary became ordinary. What would have been unthinkable in another context was accepted as discipline, management, or tradition within the plantation world. Social hierarchies reinforced this acceptance. Race, status, and wealth determined whose suffering mattered. Enslaved people were positioned outside moral concern, their pain framed as inevitable or deserved. This dehumanization allowed individuals who considered themselves respectable to participate in or benefit from violence without confronting its reality. Distance, both physical and emotional, made brutality easier to ignore. The profits of sugar extended far beyond the plantation. Urban centers thrived on trade, shipping, and processing. Merchants, bankers, and exporters all benefited, spreading responsibility so widely that accountability disappeared. Each participant handled only a fragment of the system, allowing them to deny involvement in its worst aspects. Violence became abstract, reduced to figures on a ledger, while the product moved cleanly through markets untouched by blood in appearance. Even culture adapted to support this prosperity. Celebrations, social gatherings, and rituals in the big house were funded by suffering yet framed as symbols of refinement. Music played while fields burned with labor. Fine clothing was worn by those who ordered punishments hours earlier. This dissonance was sustained through selective perception, focusing on comfort while ignoring the conditions that made it possible. Over time, this compartmentalization hardened into indifference. The long-term consequences of this normalization were profound. Violence shaped social relations, teaching generations that power could be maintained through fear and that profit justified cruelty. These lessons did not vanish with the end of slavery. They lingered in attitudes toward labor, race, and authority. The plantation became a template for inequality, its logic reproduced in new forms even as the original system faded. Memory of this violence was often suppressed to protect narratives of prosperity. Families preserved stories of success while omitting the exploitation behind it. Monuments celebrated founders without acknowledging victims. Silence again served to protect wealth, ensuring that its origins remained unquestioned. When history was told, it emphasized economic achievement rather than human cost, allowing descendants to inherit pride without confronting pain. Yet the traces of brutality remain embedded in the land, the architecture, and the social structures that survived. The big house stands not only as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder of the normalized violence that sustained it. Prosperity built on terror leaves a legacy that cannot be fully erased, shaping societies long after the screams have faded, because systems that grow accustomed to cruelty carry its imprint forward, teaching future generations that suffering can be justified when it is profitable, and that the absence of accountability allows brutality to transform into tradition and history, into a sanitized story that hides its blood-stained foundation beneath layers of success and silence.